This presentation will present some ideas for teaching successfully in a 7-week compressed term. 7-week success has many factors, but 4 that have been identified in various places, most notably in this, see the link below, are these: preparing students to succeed, content considerations, support and feedback, and then effective learning by design. These are practices we use no matter what length the term is, but they're especially important when we're compressing a class. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. First, preparing students to succeed. Some ideas here are helping students to understand what is going to happen, and you should do this very early in the class. Students need to know exactly what they need to do to succeed. This preparation might take the form of creating a list of assignments and due dates that makes it very clear to students exactly what they must do and when it is due. Another good idea is to communicate about communication. Help students understand what the rules and guidelines are for interactions in the class, such as how students should communicate with you, what your response to email policy is, and so on. For example, in a compressed class, it's quite common for an instructor to pledge a one business day response to email. If this is something you're going to do, make sure that students know it and also what they need to do if you don't have a chance to respond back to them in that time. Make sure that you very clearly explain class policies such as attendance and so on, late penalties, and those kinds of things. A lot of people do this successfully by having all this information in the syllabus and then having an activity in the class that has students read the syllabus, understand it, and in some cases complete a project about the syllabus. Next, explaining the challenges of the compressed format to students. This is especially important as we're beginning to ramp up the number of compressed classes. As students become more used to the format, then this probably will be a little less needed as it will become institutional knowledge. But here's what I think you might want to be doing. You need to explain these challenges as a way to acknowledge student fears as well as helping to prepare for the experience. Some things that students might be concerned about would be their ability to complete projects or papers or even study for exams in this compressed format. Help them by discussing the time commitment that is expected to deal with the workload in class. Help them with scheduling. Consider having discussions about the reason behind the compressed format. For example, making sure that students understand that they should only be having 2 classes at a time in the 7-week term so that they can spend all of their time engaging in those classes at a higher level than they would if they were taking 4 classes across the 15-week term. Also explain to them some of the success stories from other institutions that have taken on this compressed format and shown great things happening with their students. The other thing that you might want to include are techniques that you are doing in your class to help make sure that students are successful. Identify potential problem areas. As you consider the class you're teaching and as you gain more experience in the compressed term, you're going to become more aware of what causes the most problems for students in your particular class. It might be a particular project. It might be exam or quiz schedules and so on. As you get to know those, or as you can reliably predict them, make sure you're communicating that to students and help them develop ways of dealing with these kinds of problems. Another thing that's important is making sure that students get up to speed in the class as soon as possible. And one of the things that's recognized at doing this are introductions and quick trust activities. Many instructors already have introductions as part of the first few classes to help students begin to form as a group and help them to identify potential study partners. Another thing that can be done, or taking this a step further, would be quick trust activities that move beyond just introduction towards collaboration and trust. There are many team building activities that can be done. You can find these in books, in professional publications, and of course on the internet searches. Another thing that's important in preparing students to succeed is scaffolding group projects if you're going to use them. Group projects are problematic for many students, and a lot of times it takes a time for students to form as a small group and to understand the task, break that task up, and then divide the task and then get to creating it. One of the things that you can do is to reduce ambiguity as much as possible. Try to reduce the ambiguity of the project to that reasonable level. If possible, give students a model or example to follow if that's appropriate. If technology is going to be used by the group in any way, consider having that same technology be required for an individual activity prior to the group activity so that students have some level of comfort with the technology and the process of using it before they need it in that group project. The next thing are content considerations. First, focus on the outcomes. This is sometimes called backwards design. As you review your class and make plans for what you're going to do in each of the class meeting, resist the urge to start at the beginning and just go chapter by chapter and lecture by lecture. Instead, think about the end. That's backwards compared to what we often do when we're thinking about the class. But by thinking about the end, we can identify exactly what students have to know and what they have to be able to do. Once we know that, then we can choose or create assessments that will let you know that you have achieved these results with your students. Once you have the assessments, then you can begin designing and creating the learning activities, selecting the readings, outlining your presentations, developing projects that students will need to do in order to achieve success on the assessments that you have tailored to the outcomes in your class. You'll find that by doing this, you can often create a more effective learning path or a more efficient learning path in the new term. Next in content considerations is depth versus breadth. You need to think about the depth versus breadth ratio in your class. Many classes have the expectation to cover a great deal of material at a minimum depth. In others, it's more important to cover an increased depth but a narrower scope of content. Of course, there are those classes that do require both. It's important for you as the instructor to make good choices about where to go broad and where to go deep. Make those smart choices, and that way you have control over the workload and the cognitive load that your students have to deal with in your class. Again, you need to start at the end and make sure that what you're asking them to do actually relates to those outcomes that you've identified for the class. Next, establish relevance. This really goes to motivation. Establishing relevance helps students understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's simply making connections between the course and what the students do in that course with real-world experiences that the student have already had or what they anticipate having. Explain why they will need to know what you're teaching and what they're learning. Some things that students appreciate in this is when an instructor can share their stories of their engagement in this kind of material and this kind of content in your own professional life. It really helps them to understand your background and why this is important in the field. Finally, it's a good idea to individualize content and engagement where possible. Now, this can be challenging, but remember that individualization doesn't mean you have to create entirely different assignments for students. Consider instead having multiple options for gathering information. For example, you might create text and audio resources. They're the same resource, just in a different format. And you might also consider optional forms of expression for students to show you what they're learning. For example, in an activity, you might allow students to choose to write a report, create a poster or an infographic, or if time permits, give an oral report to demonstrate learning. Next in the 7-week success plan is support and feedback. Technical support is the first of these. In the shorter term, the consequences of not being able to log into email or JetNet or course content provided by a publisher can really be a big problem for students. They have less time to deal with this. So you need to identify technical support sources before you even begin the class. Make sure students know about the Solution Center, where they can get support for our Jackson College provided technology, and also make sure they know about the digital inclusion storefront on campus where they can buy inexpensive secondhand laptops and other technologies. Also make sure that you understand how students can be supported for any of the publisher-provided content, such as a website, for example, that you might be using in your class, so that when the inevitable occurs, you'll be able to steer students to that technical support as needed. Next is flexibility. It's really important to have deadlines in your class and to really be a stickler for those deadlines, institute late policies and so on. But keep in mind that you do have some flexibility. Use it with caution, but use it as appropriately. There are times when you as the instructor need to use that discretion to provide this flexibility to a student who has a reasonable need for accommodation. You might consider allowing a student to submit an assignment late, perhaps with a small grade penalty rather than not accepting late assignments at all. You might also create or permit alternative assignments where appropriate. And in some cases, you may be in a position to waive or drop a non-critical assignment as you see fit. Next, support and feedback and fast question responses. Students are going to have questions, they always do, and in a compressed time format, you really need to stay on top of this. You got to be proactive about responding to student questions, either in email, face-to-face, or in a JetNet forum, for example. It's really recommended that you respond to all student questions in any venue that they occur in your class in one business day. So, of course, it's easier to create this policy than to actually follow it. So, as the instructor, you need to develop ways of handling the expected volume of communication in your class. Some ideas that might help are to prioritize questions that are preventing students from progressing or are causing a lot of frustration widely in the class. Figure out how to deal with those as quickly as possible. Make sure up front you decide on your preferred methods for dealing with communications. Some instructors really prefer email. Others hate having their email inbox cluttered with student questions and really prefer to set up a forum inside of JetNet where they can deal with all of those questions as they come up. Make sure that you communicate your policies and your practices to your students so that they understand what you expect them to do when they have a question, how you will respond and in what time frame, and especially what they should do if they don't receive a response within that intended time frame. Of course, fast feedback on assignments is important. As with communications, timely feedback is crucial in the shortened term of our classes in the 7 weeks. It's really true, especially on assignments that can help a student perform better on subsequent assignments. Nothing's more frustrating than turning in your second essay before you get the feedback on the first essay, and then getting that first essay back and finding examples of things that, had you only known, you could have corrected on the second essay and gotten a better grade. Certain items, such as long-form papers, really take longer, of course, but where possible, the guidance that Jackson College has provided is to have standard items graded in a week and have that grade posted in JetNet and have feedback back to students. Now, in the longer form term projects or papers, it's understood that it might take longer. A recommendation that we might make is to use machine grading inside of JetNet where possible. This can give student immediate feedback, especially if you're using these for learning checks. Now, of course, this is not recommended for the major course assessments, such as final exams, which are much better done under your direct supervision. But if you think about it, you can use those machine-graded learning checks, little quizzes, as ways for students to practice what they're learning and to help them identify areas where they need to study more. By paying attention to these 4 factors and all of the elements of them, preparing students to succeed, content considerations, support and feedback, and then that effective learning by design, really thinking about how you're going to design your interactions with your students, we can help create a more effective 7-week term class for our students. As always, I'm always available to help you in any of these things. If you need some assistance in setting something up in JetNet, if you want some ideas, please contact me. I'm